Every night, while the city sleeps, a cleaning woman quietly scrubs the marble floors of a towering bank. But one evening, she's not alone. Hidden under a table, her 9-year-old daughter, Luna, overhears a conversation not meant for any ears. A billion-dollar betrayal that could ruin everything. The next morning, a powerful CEO stares into the eyes of a child who holds the key to his downfall, or his redemption. What happens when the truth is whispered not by men in suits, but by a little girl no one ever saw coming? Stay with us and discover how one silent night rewrote the future of an empire and created a bond stronger than blood. Luna hadn't meant to hide under the CEO's desk. It just happened that way. Her mother had asked her to wait by the window while she cleaned the executive floor, the same routine as always. But Luna's legs had grown tired, and the desk looked like a quiet place to rest for a minute. There was something comforting about being tucked into a space that wasn't hers, surrounded by expensive wood and polished leather, as if the desk itself could shelter her from the weight of being invisible. But then the door opened. Fast, too fast for her to slip out unnoticed. So she stayed, breath caught in her throat. Two men entered laughing, not the kind of laughter that meant joy, but something sharper, careless, detached. She didn't know their names yet, but their words, the way they said he'll sign it without reading and by Monday it's all moved, struck her in the gut like a slap. At first, she didn't understand what was being moved or why they were whispering about retirement like a funeral. But then one of them mentioned the name Hale, and Luna's ears locked in. That was the CEO. This was his office, and they weren't supposed to be here. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't even move, just pressed her knees to her chest and held her breath so tight her ribs ached. One of the men tossed a thick folder onto the desk, and the thud made her heart race. She memorized how he said IRTR Delta 47 like it was a secret handshake, something coded and dangerous. The words meant nothing to her, but the way they hovered in the air afterward, the pause, the satisfied silence, told her everything. Something wrong was about to happen. They spoke about servers, reroutes, vaults like in a bank. Of course, this was a bank, a big one. And these men were not planning a meeting. They were planning a theft. Of what, she wasn't sure, but it felt heavy, permanent. They talked about the CEO like he was already gone, like he didn't matter anymore. Luna had never met Mr. Hale, but her mother often said he built this place from the ground up. The way these men dismissed him made her stomach twist. She didn't even realize she'd dug her nails into the underside of the desk until her fingers began to ache. Every word etched itself into her memory, not because she wanted to remember, but because her body didn't give her a choice. When the men finally left, footsteps fading into the hallway and the door closing with a soft, final click, Luna didn't move right away. She stayed curled up for several minutes, unsure if it was safe or if this was just a pause before something worse. Her eyes darted toward the leather chair behind the desk, then the folder still resting on the polished surface above her. She wanted to run. She needed to find her mother, but her legs didn't respond at first. Her mind was a blur of numbers and strange words, and the realization that she had witnessed something very adult, very illegal, and very real. At 9, Luna already knew what silence could do. She had learned that from nights spent listening to the world talk around her as if she wasn't there. But this silence felt different. It was filled with danger. Eventually, she slid out from under the desk, legs stiff and lips trembling. She walked quickly but quietly through the corridor, her sneakers making no sound on the carpet. She didn't know what she was going to say when she found her mom. She just knew she had to say something. Eleanor found her first. She had just finished wiping down the door handles and was calling for Luna, a hint of worry in her voice, when she saw her daughter round the corner like a ghost. The child's face was pale, her eyes wide with something Eleanor hadn't seen before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of hollow alertness, like she'd aged years in the last half hour. "Luna?" she whispered, walking fast to close the distance. She knelt down, placing both hands on her daughter's shoulders. "Are you okay? What happened?" Luna didn't answer at first. She blinked up at her mother, then glanced over her shoulder toward the CEO's office. "They were in there," she said softly. "Two men. I heard them." Eleanor frowned. "Who? What did they say?" Luna swallowed, then began to speak. Not rushed, not hysterical, just clear, focused, as if her brain had already sorted everything into categories. She repeated the phrases she remembered. Delta 47, rerouting, vaults, signing without reading, the names, the intentions. Every detail she could recall. Eleanor listened, stunned. As Luna spoke, she felt a chill crawl up her spine. This wasn't just a child's imagination. This was a warning. For a long time, neither of them moved. Eleanor held Luna tightly, as if trying to protect her from the words she had just spoken. As if, by squeezing her close enough, she could pull her back into the safety of not knowing. But the damage was done. Something had been broken. Not in Luna exactly, but around her. A wall, maybe. The invisible barrier that normally keeps children at a distance from the darker sides of adulthood. Now, that wall had a hole. And through it, Luna had seen enough to understand that some adults were worse than nightmares. "We have to tell someone," Luna said, her voice muffled against her mother's shirt. Eleanor didn't respond right away. She looked back toward the CEO's office. 6 years she had worked in that building. 6 years, scrubbing marble floors and disinfecting glass walls and keeping her head down. She had never spoken to Mr. Hale, but she knew who he was. And she knew that if what Luna said was true, the man was about to lose everything. Just like that. Because two men had decided he was expendable. She felt a wave of nausea. She wasn't ready for this. But looking into Luna's eyes, steady, fierce, expecting, she realized there was no such thing as ready. That night had started like so many others. A late shift, a tired body, a child too old for her own silence. Eleanor had thought she was just getting through another workday. Cleaning offices built on bonuses she'd never receive. Filing cabinets filled with lives she'd never touch. She hadn't known the night would end, with her daughter recounting the blueprint of a heist that could shatter an empire. But there she was, holding her trembling child and realizing the world didn't ask for permission before handing you a key to a locked door. Eleanor wiped Luna's cheeks gently with the sleeve of her uniform. "We'll go home now," she said, softly but firmly. "But tomorrow, we do the right thing." Luna nodded, leaning into her mother's side. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The next step had already taken root. What they'd heard would not stay hidden, and that moment, that one moment beneath the mahogany desk, would mark the beginning of a story none of them were ready for. A story that would unravel every lie hidden inside those glass towers. And it had all started with the sound beneath the desk. Richard Hale didn't particularly enjoy early mornings, but he tolerated them out of habit. After nearly 4 decades building Iron Trust Bank into one of the most formidable financial institutions in the country, his routine had become a fortress. His coffee came at 7s, sharp, black, no sugar. His inbox was sorted by priority, color-coded by his assistant. And most mornings, the first 20 minutes were spent reviewing numbers, not faces. Which is why, when his intercom buzzed and one of the cleaning staff requested to speak to him personally, he nearly declined out of reflex. But something in the tone, measured, urgent, human, made him pause. Eleanor Carter. The name meant little to him. He gave permission, curious, but not invested. A moment later, the door opened, and there she was. Quiet, composed, but nervous, not alone. Behind her, a small girl stepped forward. She clutched a spiral notebook to her chest, the kind with a torn corner and doodles on the cover. Her eyes were far too serious for her age. "This is my daughter," Eleanor said. "She heard something last night. Something important." Richard blinked slowly, not out of impatience, but because something unspoken had already shifted. Luna didn't hesitate. She walked forward, placed the notebook carefully on Richard's desk, and opened it to the middle. There, in uneven handwriting, were names, strings of letters and numbers and short phrases. IRTR Delta 47. Vault reroute. Sign without reading. Server room after hours. Richard didn't move. His eyes scanned the page with the cold calculation of a man who'd once negotiated billion-dollar mergers without blinking. But behind that expression, his pulse quickened. He recognized the codes. Not just any random words. These were internal protocols, sensitive ones. He glanced at Eleanor, who stood silently by the door, unsure whether to explain or apologize. Then back to the girl, who stood there watching him like a doctor awaiting a diagnosis. "Where did you hear this?" he finally asked, his voice low, deliberate. Luna looked him in the eye. "Under your desk. Last night. 2 men came in. They didn't know I was there." She said it without shame, without bravado. Just fact. Richard leaned back slightly, trying to process the dissonance of this moment. The unlikely source of this intelligence. A child, not a spy, not a whistleblower. Just a girl whose mother had nowhere else to leave her. And yet somehow, here she was, delivering what could be the most important warning of his career. He wanted to be skeptical. Everything in him pushed toward dismissal. It was easier that way, safer. But something about Luna made it impossible. She didn't fidget. She didn't cry or ramble or dramatize. She just stood there, steady, watching him the way no child ever had, like she was evaluating him, the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise under scrutiny from a 9-year-old. Richard tapped the notebook with one finger. "Do you remember their names?" he asked. Luna nodded. "One of them was Paul Reeves. The other said something about Delta 47. I don't know the second name, but I think he was older, taller. He had a badge." Her recall was sharp, unnervingly so. Richard knew the name Paul Reeves well, VP of Technology, a rising star in the company, trusted. Or so he thought. But this was too specific, too accurate to ignore. His gut, long dulled by years of predictability, began to churn. He was being played. Someone inside his inner circle was moving pieces without his knowledge. He had built safeguards, delegated wisely, chosen loyalty over brilliance. Had that been a mistake? He looked back at Luna, her arms still crossed in front of her. She wasn't afraid. That scared him more than anything. Eleanor finally stepped forward. "Mr. Hale, I know this is strange, and I know we don't belong in your office, but I trust my daughter. She listens more than she talks, and when she talks, it's for a reason." Her voice trembled slightly at the end, but her words carried weight. Richard had encountered countless people in his career who spoke confidently while saying nothing. This woman, and her daughter, were the opposite. He rubbed his temple, then looked at Luna again. "Why did you write it all down?" She shrugged. "So I wouldn't forget. I thought it mattered." He exhaled slowly. Something deep inside him stirred, a mix of shame and awe. This little girl had done something he hadn't, paid attention when it counted, and not just to numbers or spreadsheets or quarterly reports. She had noticed people, patterns, danger. He stood up, walked around the desk, and knelt slightly to be eye level with her. "Do you understand what you might have just done?" Luna hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I think I helped. I just didn't want you to get blamed for something you didn't do." That answer hit harder than any accusation. Richard rose to his full height again, slower this time, but something in him felt lighter, less burdened by the posture he'd perfected over decades. He reached for the notebook and closed it gently, as if it held a map. In a way, it did. He turned to Eleanor. "Do you trust anyone else in this building?" She shook her head. "Not really." "Good," he said. "That makes 3 of us." He looked at Luna. I need to confirm a few things. But if what you've told me is true, you've done something very important." Luna didn't beam with pride. She didn't smile. She just nodded, as if it was obvious. Richard had spent his life surrounded by people trying to impress him. Assistants who flattered, directors who overpromised, executives who bent truth for performance. This was something else entirely. He realized with sudden clarity that the empire he had built, the one now under threat, might be saved not by strategy or legal maneuvering, but by a girl who didn't even own a proper pair of dress shoes. He straightened his tie, the gesture automatic, grounding. "I'll be in touch," he told Eleanor. "Don't talk to anyone else about this, not yet." She agreed. They turned to leave. As they stepped out, Richard remained still. Alone now, he stood with the notebook in his hand, unable to shake the image of Luna standing across from him. Not as a child, but as a mirror. He had spent years making decisions that protected shareholders, growth charts, and market positions. But this was different. This wasn't about risk. This was about betrayal. And if what she'd written was even half true, then he wasn't just facing corporate sabotage. He was facing a takedown engineered from within his trusted circle. As he opened the notebook once more, scanning Luna's careful handwriting, something else occurred to him. In all these years, no one had ever walked into his office to warn him just because it was right. Not without expecting something in return. Until today. Until her. Richard Hale, a man conditioned to trust no one, realized that the person most capable of saving him might be the only one with no agenda at all. For the first time in years, he felt that still, quiet flicker of fear, the kind that whispers, "You have more to lose than you thought." And across that thin page of notebook paper, a child had just reminded him of it. Tom Kirkland hadn't touched a government-issued badge in nearly 8 years, but the way he sat at the long glass table in the private compliance room of Iron Trust made it clear instincts like his never fully went dormant. The retired FBI agent had been pulled back in reluctantly, called by Richard Hale himself, with few details and even fewer explanations. But the urgency in the man's voice had been unmistakable. Now, with a secure company laptop open in front of him and administrator credentials provided by the CEO, Tom worked through internal access logs, firewall reports, and archived server requests with the precision of a man who'd once hunted domestic espionage. After just 40 minutes, he paused. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath, leaning back slightly and rubbing the corner of his jaw. Delta 47 wasn't just a test environment, it was a fallback protocol for off-grid asset migration, used only during large-scale system breaches or under government audit. Seeing it scheduled for activation in 2 days, under Paul Reeves's credentials, but without board approval. That wasn't sloppy work. It was calculated misdirection. Someone had planned this meticulously. Luna's words hadn't been a child's misunderstanding. They had been a blueprint, a warning. Janet Mulroney sat quietly beside Tom, her usually crisp demeanor unraveling by the second. The head of compliance had reviewed thousands of reports in her career, flagged dozens of internal discrepancies, and had built a reputation as Iron Trust's moral compass. But what she was seeing now, unauthorized access routes created through backdoor admin tunnels, encrypted transfers labeled under innocuous budget lines, transaction logs redirected to offline mirrors, was something else entirely. As Tom clicked open a folder labeled Redacted Client Vault, Janet gripped her hands together, trying to still their trembling. The videos began playing, grainy but clear. Eleanor's strategically placed phones had captured Paul and another executive, Douglas Simmons, head of cybersecurity, discussing the reroute plan in detail. "He'll never read the final page," Douglas had said, smiling as he sipped coffee from a company mug. "Richard signs blindly when it comes from us." Tom looked at Janet then, and for a moment both just stared at the screen. Not because of the content, That was damning enough, but because of how it had been captured. "You said the janitor's daughter got this?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. Janet nodded slowly. "She didn't just overhear them," she said softly. "She listened. She understood." Tom leaned forward again, replaying the footage and freezing it mid-sentence. "Kids don't normally remember things like this," he said. "Not codes, not exact phrases, not body language cues." Janet glanced sideways. She remembered which man was holding the folder, who spoke first, who initiated the password conversation, even which drawer the files were stuffed into. She rubbed her temple. "I've seen senior staff forget half that in a board meeting." For a moment, silence settled over the room, not from lack of data, but from the enormity of what they were uncovering. The betrayal wasn't circumstantial. It wasn't reactive. It had been orchestrated over months, possibly longer, and masked under the very protocols meant to protect the company in emergencies. "They built a ghost network," Tom said. "A parallel system with just enough overlap to go unnoticed, until the money was gone." He didn't need to finish the thought. The money would vanish, and Richard Hale would take the fall. The pieces clicked together too perfectly. That kind of precision required deep knowledge and arrogance in equal measure. Janet's breath caught in her throat as she realized just how close they'd come to handing everything over to criminals without even knowing it. They continued digging, chasing logins and matching access logs with employee schedules. The pattern was deliberate. Paul had begun using Delta 47 as a cover 3 months earlier, under the guise of internal audits. Douglas had created phantom client profiles, real-sounding names with social security numbers that belonged to deceased individuals or foreign shell corporations. The plan wasn't just to extract digital vaults. It was to rewrite the very structure of Iron Trust's back-end, laundering assets through a network of contracts that to the board would look like internal reallocation. "This is sophisticated," Tom muttered, typing rapidly as he traced one of the profiles back to a crypto wallet in the Caymans. "But not flawless. They got comfortable." Janet's voice came through tight. "They underestimated us." Tom shook his head. "No, they underestimated her." He meant Luna, and it was true. If not for that girl, hiding under a desk she never should have been near, they'd be weeks away from a catastrophe no audit would have caught in time. Janet pulled up the audio file again, rewinding to the moment where Douglas said, "The beauty is, no one ever questions the fallback protocols. They just let the system reset and blame the tech." Janet closed her eyes. "Until now." As evening crept closer, the two of them prepared a classified report for Richard, one that could not be emailed or uploaded, only hand-delivered. Tom encrypted the files and loaded them onto a physical drive, while Janet documented the timestamps of every digital signature used in the last 90 days. "We'll need to speak to Richard tonight," she said, closing her laptop. "This can't wait until morning." Tom nodded. But before shutting the final file, he paused and opened the notebook Eleanor had handed him hours earlier. Luna's notes, photocopied and stapled neatly. Her handwriting was small, tight, but methodical. And the last line? It wasn't a code or a quote. It was a question. Why would someone steal from the man who built the whole thing? Tom read it twice. That one sentence held a weight none of their evidence could match. It captured the core of the betrayal, the heart of the crime. It wasn't just theft. It was dismantling a legacy with surgical coldness. Janet stood beside him, still shaken. "She doesn't even know how much she's helped," she said. Tom replied quietly, "And I hope she never has to." By the time they left the compliance room, carrying the weight of their findings and the responsibility to act, both Tom and Janet had reached a silent understanding. What had begun as suspicion was now an emergency. But more than that, it was personal. This wasn't just about saving a company. It was about preserving truth in a place that had allowed lies to flourish under the guise of trust. And standing at the center of it all wasn't a whistleblower, a board member, or an internal auditor, but a 9-year-old girl with eyes too big for her age and a heart too steady for the chaos she'd just interrupted. Janet, usually so composed, felt her voice catch in her throat again as they walked toward the elevator. "She didn't just listen," she said again, more to herself this time. She understood. And that scared her more than any ghost protocol, any rogue transaction, or any courtroom. Because children like Luna weren't supposed to carry the burden of saving empires, and yet here they were. Eleanor clocked in like she always had, badge swipe, locker, gloves, and entered the 49th floor with the quiet presence of someone who had long ago mastered the art of invisibility. But tonight, she wasn't just here to mop floors or disinfect desks. Tonight, she was listening, watching, moving with purpose under the veil of routine. She carried 2 phones now, her own and a second one Richard had given her through Janet. Thin, silent, barely noticeable. She had memorized the path of the security cameras and now knew where their blind spots began and ended. When she placed the second phone behind the panel in the server access corridor, her hands didn't shake. 6 years ago, this job had been survival. Now it felt like something else. Not quite revenge, but resistance. She wasn't just cleaning an office. She was scrubbing away lies. And as she wiped the smudged fingerprints off Douglas Simmons's glass table, she replayed Luna's voice in her head. He said hail signs blindly. She didn't flinch when the man himself passed by her again and didn't offer a glance. She preferred it that way. Let them keep looking past her. It made her job easier. Luna wasn't with her tonight, not physically, but she was there in every movement. Eleanor could feel her daughter's presence like an echo in her bones. Earlier that morning, they had gone over a floor map of the executive wing, drawing arrows and initials, circling spots with thick markers. Luna had taken it seriously, more like a mission than a game. "They like to whisper near the south elevator," she had said. "There's no cameras by the vending machine." Eleanor had nodded. They didn't speak in long stretches. There was no need. But when Luna had placed a sticky note on her hand that read IRTR, Eleanor had folded it and placed it in her bra like it was sacred. This new partnership between them didn't need explanations. They had lived too long as background noise to the world around them, but now, in this strange pocket of shared danger, something deeper had taken root. Eleanor trusted Luna's instincts as much as she trusted her own, and when she checked the position of the phone she had taped beneath a chair in the executive break room, she thought, "My daughter's eyes see what mine never dared to." The silence between them had shifted since that first night. Before, it had been filled with fatigue, unspoken worries, the dull weight of routine. Now, it hummed with awareness. Eleanor started to recognize Luna's small behaviors, the way she chewed her thumbnail when her mind was racing, the way she tilted her head when analyzing something too complex for words. And in return, Luna had begun to watch her mother more intently too. That morning, while Eleanor was tying her shoes, Luna had reached over and tightened the knot without being asked. "They'll notice if your shoelace is untied. Be careful." Eleanor had smiled, a rare, slow smile, and squeezed her daughter's wrist in response. That was their version of saying, "I love you." These weren't affectionate people by nature. Life hadn't allowed it. But now, in this shared act of silent defiance, they had discovered something precious, the undeniable strength of moving as one. Eleanor no longer felt like she was working alone. Every cleaning rag, every cart push, every clipboard she pretended to read now had Luna behind it. And the floor she had once scrubbed out of obligation now became the very ground where they were building something impossible. Power. The men they were watching, Paul, Douglas, even a few quiet ones who lingered late for reasons that made her uneasy, had no idea how closely they were being observed. Eleanor began noting their patterns. Who left early, who stayed late, who checked their phones in the same corners, who always whispered before walking into meetings. The corporate mask they wore in daylight often slipped after hours, and she'd learned to read their bodies better than their words. At 9:52 p.m., she watched Paul hand off a sealed envelope to someone in a dark navy suit who wasn't on the employee list. She noted the exchange, memorized the man's gait, and went straight to the server corridor to check the recorder. Luna would know what to do with the footage. That thought grounded her more than anything else. Her daughter, this small, fierce child with hair too wild for school policies and eyes too sharp for her age, was the mind guiding this entire operation. Eleanor had once dreamed of her daughter becoming a doctor or a lawyer. Now she didn't care what Luna became. All she wanted was to see her daughter stand tall, knowing her voice had mattered when it most needed to. The partnership had changed Eleanor. She didn't walk with her head down anymore, not because she expected recognition, that was never part of the contract, but because she was now aware of how much people missed when they refused to look at someone like her. The higher-ups passed her in the hallway with blind eyes, never realizing that the woman pushing the cleaning cart was the reason their names hadn't already made the front page, and maybe that was the irony. They had spent their entire lives building firewalls, hiring security firms, inventing complex systems to protect themselves, and yet the person who would bring their empire down was the woman they never bothered to greet. Eleanor didn't feel vengeance. She felt clarity. The same kind Luna had carried into Richard Hale's office when she laid that notebook on his desk like it was a ledger. That night, as Eleanor closed the janitor's closet and removed the gloves from her hands, she thought of her daughter again. They hadn't spoken since that morning. But somehow Eleanor knew exactly what Luna would ask when she got home. "Did you place the phone in the hallway by HR?" And she'd answer with a nod. Always a nod. Their communication had become a rhythm. Glances, nods, quiet confirmations over dinner that held more weight than full conversations. They didn't need to talk to know what the other was thinking, and maybe that was what made it so powerful. In a world that had always made them feel small, overlooked, breakable, they had become necessary to each other in a way that left no room for hesitation. The alliance between them wasn't born from strategy or duty, it was born from survival, and now, evolution. Eleanor didn't know what would come next. She only knew this: whatever storm was brewing inside Iron Trust, she and Luna would face it together. Tonight had proven it again. They didn't speak much, but they saw everything. And in that silence, deeper than any threat or boardroom plan, something unshakable had been formed. A bond that turned a cleaner and a child into the most dangerous players on the board. Richard Hale entered the staff cafeteria quietly, almost self-consciously. It was well past lunch, and the space was mostly cleared out, just a few forgotten trays near the return bin and the hum of a vending machine trying too hard to matter. In the far corner, sitting at a small round table with a peanut butter sandwich and a bottle of orange juice, was Luna. She didn't notice him at first, or maybe she did and just didn't care to react. Either way, Richard stood there for a moment, unsure of the protocol. He'd spent decades commanding boardrooms, speaking to investors, dismantling entire departments with a few carefully chosen words. And yet here, approaching a 9-year-old girl, with dirt on her sneakers and a notebook in her lap, he felt strangely exposed. He cleared his throat gently and approached. "May I?" he asked, nodding at the seat across from her. Luna shrugged. "It's not my table." He smiled faintly and sat. For the next 2 minutes, neither of them said a word. She chewed slowly. He watched. It wasn't awkward. It was honest. When she finally looked up, there was no pretense in her gaze. "You still don't know how deep it goes," she said softly. Richard leaned forward slightly. "I'm starting to understand," he said. Luna nodded, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It wasn't pristine. She'd clearly opened and closed it a dozen times, but she placed it carefully between them, like it was something sacred. Richard unfolded it slowly. Inside was another string of numbers and letters, this one different from the Delta 47 protocol. It was on the screen when the tall one, Douglas, logged into the internal console. I only saw it for 2 seconds, but I remembered. She said it plainly, as if this kind of recall was nothing special. But Richard knew what he was looking at. A login token, unique, limited use, tied to administrator clearance. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. "No," she said. "I just knew it mattered." He stared at her, not in disbelief anymore. That phase had passed. Now he was looking at Luna like someone trying to reorient themselves after a storm. This wasn't about genius. This was about instinct, raw, clear, untaught. She didn't understand the structure of betrayal, but she recognized its scent. And that, Richard realized, was what terrified him the most. She had no armor, but she knew the enemy. "You shouldn't have to carry this," he said after a moment, his voice lower now. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a confession. Luna wiped her mouth with a napkin and shrugged again. "It's not heavy, not compared to watching people act like you're not even there." Richard flinched at the simplicity of her reply. There were moments in his career that had shaped him. Betrayals, losses, deals that nearly broke him. But none of them had felt like this. This was something else. This was truth without ego. A child telling him what she had seen because no one else had noticed, because no one else had bothered to look. "You're not invisible, you know," he said. Luna didn't smile. She just looked at him like she didn't believe him yet, and he couldn't blame her. "I didn't do this for you," she added, almost as an afterthought. "I did it because my mum said when you see something wrong, you say something. Otherwise, you're part of it." Her words landed with more weight than any accusation ever had. Richard didn't try to respond right away. What could he say? That she was right? That he'd built an empire on seeing everything, and yet missed this? They sat there in silence again, but this time it felt heavier, not uncomfortable, but dense with everything unspoken between them. Richard looked at the login string again. He didn't need IT to confirm it. He recognized the pattern. It was genuine. The betrayal was deeper than he'd feared. But more than that, the evidence had been handed to him not by an audit or an internal report or a high-paid consultant. It had been placed into his hands by a little girl with worn-out sneakers and a notebook filled with truths. Richard folded the paper again and slipped it into his jacket pocket without ceremony. "Thank you," he said. It was the simplest thing he could offer, and the only thing that felt honest. Luna nodded, almost imperceptibly, and went back to her sandwich. He could have left then. Should have. Maybe. But something made him stay. Watching her eat, he saw not a prodigy, not a puzzle piece in his investigation, but a child, hungry, quiet, sharp in ways no child should have to be. And for the first time in a very long time, Richard Hale felt seen. Not as a CEO, not as a nameplate on a door, just as a man. He found himself wanting to say something else, something meaningful, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply leaned back and let the silence settle between them like a shared secret. It wasn't often someone handed him something without an angle, without expectation, without a price tag. But that's what Luna had done. Again, she had given him something valuable, something dangerous, and hadn't asked for anything in return. Not praise, not recognition, just a place to put the truth. That kind of gift unsettled him more than any boardroom ambush. And yet, it also grounded him, reminded him what he still stood to lose, what he needed to protect. When Luna finished the last bite of her sandwich, she reached into her backpack and pulled out her notebook again, jotting something down. Richard didn't ask what. He didn't need to. As he stood, he looked at her one last time, and there was something different in his expression now. Not gratitude, not admiration, but care. Real, startled care. She looked up briefly, met his eyes, and then looked away. She wasn't waiting for permission. She wasn't here to impress him. But Richard Hale, for the first time in years, felt what it was like to be watched over, and it was a 9-year-old girl who made him feel it. The air inside the Iron Trust auditorium felt thin, charged with the kind of tension that usually preceded mergers or mass layoffs. But today, something else was brewing. Richard Hale stood backstage, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored jacket with methodical fingers, though his pulse betrayed him. Steady hands, racing heart. Janet Mulroney passed him the microphone, her face pale but composed. "They're in their seats," she whispered. "Front row, smiling." Richard didn't need to look to know who she meant. Paul Reeves and Douglas Simmons, both impeccably dressed, both obliviously confident, sat in the spotlight like stars of their own show. Paul even had the nerve to wink at one of the financial reporters seated nearby. Douglas, hands folded neatly, nodded at the board members as if he were already next in line. Richard hated how calm they looked. It infuriated him. But then he caught sight of a flash of movement behind the curtain stage left. A small hand gripping the velvet edge. Luna. She was watching. Silent. Steady. And that, more than anything else, gave him courage. He took a breath, nodded once, and stepped onto the stage. The room erupted in flashes. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts, capturing the man of the hour, the founder, the legend, the architect of a billion-dollar empire. Richard forced a small, rehearsed smile and made his way to the podium as dozens of hands raised phones to record. "Good morning," he began, voice even. "I want to thank all of you for being here on what was meant to be a day of closure, a day of transition. After over 3 decades at Iron Trust, I had intended to announce my retirement today." And a wave of murmurs rippled across the room. Some surprised, others merely confirming rumors that had floated in recent weeks. Paul and Douglas leaned back slightly as if savoring the moment. "But before I speak of endings," Richard continued, "I believe it's only fair to speak of truths." He turned toward the AV technician stationed in the wings and gave a subtle nod. The lights dimmed. The massive screen behind him flickered to life. For a split second there was only static, then grainy footage, a timestamp in the corner, 2 familiar voices. "He'll sign it without reading. He always does." Paul's voice, clear and cocky, filled the room like a bad omen finally being named. "We move the digital assets by Saturday. Offshore's ready." Then came Douglas laughing. "And by Monday, Hale's sipping whiskey in the Bahamas while we're set for life. Easy as hell." Laughter. Coded terms. A shared arrogance that made every board member stiffen in their seats. The footage cut to another clip, this one showing a printed document with the header IRTR Delta 47, followed by Paul tapping the signature line with a smug smile. "We even used his own protocol." The audience sat frozen, suspended between disbelief and the slow, creeping horror of realization. Richard said nothing. He didn't need to. The video spoke louder than any statement he could have drafted. When the screen went black again, there was a long silence. No coughs, no rustling. Just stillness, broken only when 2 suited men in the back of the room stood and opened their jackets, badges gleaming. "Paul Reeves, Douglas Simmons," one of the agents called out. "You're under federal investigation. Please stand." The room snapped awake. Paul jumped to his feet, immediately shouting, "This is insane! That video is fake! You don't know what you're doing!" Douglas, white as chalk, didn't even move. 2 agents approached, cuffing both men in practiced movements while press cameras went into a frenzy. Flash after flash captured the fall. Once powerful executives now reduced to shocked, sputtering suspects. Richard didn't blink. He didn't gloat. He just watched them being led away. their tailored suits now ill-fitting masks of shame. As Paul was dragged past him, he muttered through clenched teeth, "You have no idea what you've just done." Richard finally met his eyes and said without flinching, "No, Paul, I know exactly what I've done. I listened." The double doors swung open as the agents took them away. Reporters exploded with questions, none of which Richard answered. Instead, he turned back to the microphone and said simply, "That will be all for today." And with that, he walked off the stage, not to applause, not to a standing ovation, but to something more rare in corporate America, silence carved by consequence. Backstage, Janet was already wiping her eyes. Tom Kirkland, arms crossed, gave him a solemn nod. "You did it," he said. "No," Richard replied, his voice low. "She did it." He moved past them both and stepped into the narrow hallway behind the stage, ignoring the chaos spilling out into the lobby. That was someone else's problem now. He wasn't looking for closure. He was looking for the one person who had cracked open the impossible. Behind the heavy curtain stage left, barely visible in the shadows, Luna stood with her back pressed to the wall, arms wrapped around herself. Her eyes, wide and wet, met his. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching what she had set in motion. Richard approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. "They're gone," he said softly. Luna nodded, blinking fast. "I saw." Her voice was barely audible. "Are you okay?" he asked. She hesitated, then finally, "I didn't know it would feel like this." Richard understood. Justice didn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it just felt like weightlifting. He crouched down to her level, gently placing a hand over his heart. "You gave me back everything I was about to lose." She looked at him, a single tear sliding down her cheek, and then finally she whispered, "I just wanted you to be safe." Richard had spent the last 2 hours giving statements, answering carefully curated questions, and fending off board members who suddenly found themselves eager to support whatever came next. But now, finally, he stood outside his office door with something unfamiliar fluttering in his chest. Hesitation. Eleanor stood beside him, posture straight despite the exhaustion in her eyes, and Luna, still in her hoodie and 2 big sneakers, clutched the same worn notebook she had carried since that first day. Richard opened the door and gestured them inside, pausing just a moment before following. Inside, the room felt different, not because of the space itself, but because of who was standing in it. Eleanor glanced around, clearly unsure where to stand. Luna went straight to the window, peeking through the blinds like she used to do in hiding, only now unafraid. Richard cleared his throat, sat behind his desk, and gestured to the 2 chairs across from him. "Please, sit." They did. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Richard, a man who had once negotiated the merger of 3 banks in a single afternoon, now found himself fumbling for a way to say, "Thank you." But nothing felt like enough, and maybe that was the point. "I'm not sure I know how to properly express what your actions meant," Richard began, his voice low, not quite formal, but not yet vulnerable. "To the company, yes, but more than that, to me." He looked at Eleanor, who offered a polite smile, her hands folded in her lap with the same grace she used when folding towels or wiping glass. But Luna was the one who mattered most in this moment, and she was watching him, eyes not suspicious, not expectant, just waiting. He continued, "There were things I forgot to see, people I stopped noticing, protocols I took for granted, but you didn't. You saw." Luna tilted her head, then opened her notebook, flipping to a page she had marked with a paperclip. She didn't hand it to him. She just read, "IRTR Delta 47. 03:17 a.m. Full redirect scheduled. Secondary access confirmed under Reeves X." Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't dramatize the words. She just let them fall into the space between them like facts. But what Richard felt in that moment had nothing to do with evidence. It was the stillness in her tone, the way she said what mattered and nothing more, that shook him. "I only did it," Luna said finally, closing the notebook, "because I didn't want you to be blamed for something you didn't do." There was no performance in her words, no need for recognition, just the clarity of a child who had carried something much heavier than she should have. Eleanor blinked hard, looking down at her lap, her lips pressed tight as if trying to contain both pride and sorrow. Richard swallowed, trying to keep his own emotions in check. "Most people," he said quietly, "would have run, even adults. They would have kept silent, walked away. You didn't." Luna shrugged. "I thought you looked sad. Not the kind of sad you show, the kind that hides behind the eyes, like when my mom used to pretend we were okay when we weren't." That hit something in Richard he didn't know was still alive. Not since Meredith passed. Not since his daughter stopped calling. He didn't respond immediately, unsure if anything he could say wouldn't diminish the gravity of what had just been said. All he could do was nod, not to dismiss it, but to hold space for it, to let it live between them, real and unchanged. Then Luna leaned forward slightly and pointed at the pen on his desk, a gold Mont Blanc, a gift from the board on his 50th birthday. "Can I use that?" she asked. Richard blinked, startled, then smiled. "Of course." He uncapped it and handed it to her with 2 fingers, gently, like an offering. Luna pulled the sticky notepad toward her and wrote slowly, carefully, like it mattered, and it did. When she finished, she didn't say a word, just nudged the notepad toward him. One name written in firm, looping letters: Luna Carter. Richard stared at it as if it were a signature on a document worth billions, and maybe in a way it was. He had watched countless men and women scribble their names on agreements, checks, deals, and farewell letters. But this name carried no transaction, no clause. It wasn't binding. And yet, it was the most valuable thing that had ever been signed in that office, because it came without agenda, without demand. It was simply a child affirming, "I was here, I helped, I mattered." Eleanor finally spoke. She writes her name when she wants to remember something was important. Her voice was soft but steady. When she thinks it'll mean something later. Richard didn't look up from the note. "She's right," he said. "It already does." For a moment, they just sat there. No urgency. No deals to close, no deadlines to chase. Just 3 people caught in a strange but sacred moment of stillness, stitched together not by titles or blood, but by what they had survived and what they had stopped from happening. Luna reached for the pen again, but stopped herself. One name was enough. She had said what needed saying. Richard picked up the sticky note like it was made of glass and slid it into the top drawer of his desk, on top of a folder labeled Legacy. Eleanor smiled. "We should go," she said, gently nudging her daughter. Luna stood, gave a small nod to Richard, and walked toward the door. He rose with them, watching silently as they left his office. But before the door closed, he looked back at the desk, at the name. Luna Carter. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Hale believed in something again. The first day at the new school didn't start with balloons or excitement. Luna Carter sat in the back of the black car Richard had arranged, holding her backpack tightly on her lap like it might escape if she loosened her grip. Eleanor had braided her hair neatly, pressing a kiss to her forehead before she left, whispering something in Haitian Creole that Luna didn't fully translate but understood anyway. At the school gates, a woman with a pressed blazer and warm smile greeted her, saying all the right things about opportunity, community, and how special Luna must be to be given a full ride. Luna nodded, eyes scanning everything. The kids with monogrammed lunchboxes, the hallways lined with posters for robotics clubs and art exhibitions. It all felt like a movie she wasn't supposed to be in. In class, no one laughed at her for asking smart questions, but they didn't quite understand her silences either. She wasn't bullied, she wasn't embraced, she just was, present, alert, but not yet rooted. And still, When the final bell rang, she didn't want to go home. She asked the driver to take her to Iron Trust, like always. The school was new, but that building still felt like her. She stepped into the Iron Trust lobby like someone returning to a safe house. The front desk security smiled, already knowing who she was, no ID needed. She didn't have to explain herself. That, in itself, felt like a gift. Upstairs, the elevator creaked upward slowly, floor by floor, as if honoring her quiet return. On the 49th floor, Eleanor was still cleaning as usual, her cart parked beside the executive wing, headphones in, humming softly. Luna waved, and her mother responded with the kind of nod that said, "Go ahead." She already knew where Luna was headed. The glass-walled corner where the CEO's office stood felt more like a waiting room for something else now. Richard Hale didn't look surprised when she appeared, notebook in hand, already familiar with the ritual they'd never really discussed. "Coffee?" he asked. She nodded. They sat across from each other with 2 steaming mugs between them. Some days they talked about current events or what she was learning. Other days they sat in total silence, sipping. And that silence was never uncomfortable. It was earned, understood. Like both had agreed that presence mattered more than words. Janet Mulroney had once walked past them during one of those silent coffee sessions and paused in the doorway. "You two look like you've been doing this for 20 years, she said, half amused, half wistful. Richard smirked. "Feels like it sometimes." Luna didn't respond, but she smiled at Janet with a kind of softness that was rare for her. Maybe because Janet didn't treat her like a genius or a story. She simply invited her in. Over the next few weeks, Janet began teaching Luna the basics of digital infrastructure, how encryption layers worked, how phishing schemes were identified, why human error was the real vulnerability in most systems. It was never structured, never condescending. "Here's something cool," she'd say, opening a terminal or sketching on a whiteboard, and Luna absorbed it all with quiet curiosity, asking questions only when something truly didn't make sense. She never asked twice. Janet started leaving notes for her when she wasn't around, little puzzles, system logs with anomalies for Luna to spot. Not tests, just play. And for the first time, Luna found learning wasn't just a way to survive. It could be joy. Tom Kirkland had his own way of mentoring. He never called it that. He just started leaving books on Richard's desk. FBI case files, declassified training manuals, old intelligence operations. Luna would find them and carry them home, some so old the pages crinkled when she turned them. One day, she asked Tom what asset conditioning meant. He raised an eyebrow, then grinned. "We'll start with page 34, he said. From then on, he'd sit with her in the break room once a week, explaining the art of observation, patterns of deception, and how real surveillance was often more about patience than gadgets. "Being invisible is power," he told her. "But knowing when not to be invisible, that's wisdom." Eleanor watched from a distance, sometimes pausing her work to listen. She never interrupted, but inside her, something stirred. An ache, maybe, at seeing her daughter welcomed into rooms she had once only cleaned. And yet, it was pride too, because none of this was charity. Luna had earned every seat at every table. Still, no one ever used the word gifted around her. That word had too much weight. It turned children into trophies or projects. Instead, they treated her like what she really was, a kid. A kid who had seen too much too soon, yes. But also one who laughed when Tom made bad coffee, or who rolled her eyes when Janet made her solve a network breach with sticky notes and paperclips. For fun. No one asked her to save the world. No one asked her to prove herself again. That was the real freedom they gave her, not a title or scholarship, but the space to exist without being measured. She could ask dumb questions. She could draw cats in the margins of her notebooks. She could be brilliant without always being right. At Iron Trust, Luna could choose who she wanted to be on any given day, a child curious about the world or a giant ready to take it apart and understand how it works. And sometimes on the best days, she was both. The elevator back down always moved slowly, and Luna liked that. It gave her time to think about everything she'd learned that day, time to replay conversations, time to carry quiet victories in her chest like folded notes. On one particular Friday, after spending nearly 2 hours configuring a dummy firewall Janet had set up for her as a challenge, Luna stepped into the elevator and pressed the ground floor button. As the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of Richard in his office, still reading something she'd left him, a handwritten list of access protocols and a single sentence at the end. "This system is only as strong as the people protecting it." He looked up just in time to see her wave. He nodded once, hand resting over the paper like it was a message worth guarding. And as the elevator began its slow descent, Luna leaned back against the rail, eyes closed. Not because she was tired, but because she finally could be. The room was larger than most theaters Luna had ever stepped into, and it hummed with a low tension that no amount of rehearsed speeches or projected confidence could quiet. Rows of chairs were filled with industry veterans, cybersecurity executives, former intelligence officials, and teenagers from across the country, each one of them a finalist in the National Cyber Shield Youth Competition. Luna Carter, now 14, stood backstage with her badge clipped neatly to her blazer, her hair pulled back in a way that mirrored her precision. Her code presentation, codenamed Delta Lock, was scheduled last in the lineup. She hadn't told anyone that Richard Hale would be in the audience, hidden in the shadows by choice, nor had she told him what her final slide would say. He sat in the back row, silent, elbows resting on his knees. Eleanor sat next to him, her hand closed tightly around something small in her palm, a key on a silver chain. Her daughter had given it to her just that morning, whispering, "For the door we opened together." Richard had watched Eleanor's eyes shimmer when she'd first read the inscription etched into the key. He didn't ask questions. He never needed to. The competition was ruthless in its standards. Real-world simulations, forensic decryption, ethical hacking challenges, everything under the scrutiny of judges who had built firewalls for governments and cracked criminal networks for a living. Luna's team had come this far through relentless strategy, but the final challenge was solo, a live breakdown of a cybersecurity threat and a solution in front of the entire auditorium. The girl, who once hid beneath a mahogany table on the 49th floor, now stood center stage beneath bright lights, her voice steady as she opened with, "Security isn't about systems, it's about people. We protect what we understand, and we fail when we assume understanding is a luxury." As she moved through her presentation, explaining how invisible threat patterns could be caught through anomaly layering and behavior mapping, Richard recognized parts of himself in her tone, the discipline, the control, but something far more powerful as well. She carried a warmth in her delivery, a clarity that no corporation could manufacture. When she spoke about the human cost of breaches, she wasn't quoting statistics. She was speaking about trust and loss and vigilance born from places beyond boardrooms. The final slide was a surprise even to the judges. Instead of code, it showed a blurry photo taken 5 years earlier, a young girl crouched beneath a table, eyes wide, a notebook in her lap. The caption beneath read, "The first firewall I ever built was silence. The second was courage." The room didn't make a sound. The judges didn't blink, and Richard in the back row closed his eyes. He remembered that exact notebook, the one she carried into his office. He remembered how he almost didn't listen. Beside him, Eleanor pressed the key in her hand more tightly, as if the metal could carry memory or hold back tears. Luna ended the presentation with the line, "This isn't just a profession. For some of us, It's the only language we have to rewrite what was never supposed to happen." The applause started slow. Then it grew, not loud but deep, respectful, earned. When the announcement came minutes later, Luna Carter, first place, Richard didn't move. Eleanor stood up. She looked down at him, eyes glistening, then leaned in and whispered, "She did it." He nodded. "No, you both did." Luna stood on stage holding her plaque, lights flashing, cameras clicking, but her attention drifted back to where she knew they were sitting. She couldn't see them clearly, but she didn't need to. She could feel them. She held the mic like she'd held that pen years ago in Richard's office, not like a weapon, but like something sacred. Her acceptance speech was short. She looked down once at the note she'd written, then said, "I know some of you expect me to talk about code or talent or algorithms, but the truth is, none of this started with a computer." A pause. Then, "It started the night my mother couldn't find a babysitter." The crowd chuckled softly, but she didn't laugh. Her face was calm, steady. "That night, I ended up in a room I wasn't supposed to be in, hearing things I wasn't supposed to hear. But what I found wasn't just danger, it was possibility. Because sometimes the door that changes your life doesn't look like a door. Sometimes it's a conference table. Sometimes it's glass walls. Sometimes it's a woman who cleans after hours and decides not to stay silent." The words hung in the air, heavier than the trophy in her hands. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, eyes locked on her daughter with a kind of disbelief only mothers know. The awe of watching your child become more than even your dreams allowed. Richard leaned back in his seat, and for a moment the years fell away. All the billion-dollar deals, the international summits, the signatures and mergers, none of it had left the mark that this single sentence did. Luna's voice softened as she closed. "The window in that boardroom was open that night. I remember the wind. I remember the lights. I remember thinking the world out there wasn't for people like us. But I was wrong. The world doesn't open its arms. It opens its windows. And sometimes—" "That's enough." She stepped back from the podium, not needing to say more. The crowd stood. The applause rose. But in the back, Richard didn't clap. He stood silently, eyes full, watching the girl who saved his legacy and built her own in its place. And in Eleanor's hand, the key now felt warm. Richard Hale stood alone in the office that had defined his identity for over 3 decades. The desk, the same polished oak he once thought would be his final resting ground of ambition, was now clear, except for a single leather folder and a yellow post-it note stuck carefully on top. He didn't need to open the folder. He had read those papers 6 times already. Inside were the documents for a symbolic adoption, drafted not by obligation or sentimentality, but by something quieter and more enduring: intention. His lawyers had insisted on calling it a guardian agreement, the most formal term available for a man adopting a teenager without disrupting existing legal guardianship. But for Richard, those were just words. The post-it, however, said everything. Written in Luna's clean, confident handwriting, it read, "Family is who stays after everything falls apart." He stood there, motionless, for longer than he'd expected, not because he doubted his decision, but because he realized he no longer needed to question it. He reached out and ran his fingers over the words as if they were braille for the heart. Then he placed the note gently back on the folder and walked out without looking back. The elevator ride down wasn't as symbolic as people might imagine. Richard didn't reflect on his career, the legacy of Iron Trust, or even the billions that passed through his hands over the years. What he thought about instead was the way Luna had said goodbye to him the day before. She didn't hug him. She didn't cry. She simply handed him the note and said, "Dinner's at 7, don't be late." There was something in her tone, playful, expectant, real, that made him feel, for the first time in a long while, like someone who had a place to arrive at. He didn't carry briefcases or farewell gifts, just a bottle of red wine Eleanor once said she liked but couldn't afford. As he exited the building, the security guard nodded at him like any other day. No speeches, no red carpet. And that somehow felt perfect. Because this ending wasn't about applause. It was about what came next. The life waiting outside the revolving doors. The dinner table that wasn't made of glass. Eleanor Carter had just finished setting the last plate when the knock came at the door. She didn't hurry. She didn't smooth her dress or check her reflection. She simply walked over and opened the door with the kind of ease that only comes when someone has earned your trust over time, in late-night conversations, in shared secrets, in small silences. Richard stood there holding the bottle, unsure if he should speak first. But Eleanor beat him to it. "I hope you like stew. It's not fancy," he smiled, stepping inside. "After 30 years of steak dinners and boardroom lunches, stew sounds perfect." She chuckled and took the wine. In the background, Luna's voice called out, "Mom, did you find the spoons?" Eleanor yelled back, "Check the second drawer, baby." The house smelled of something slow-cooked and comforting. No art on the walls, no chandeliers, but every corner of the room felt lived in, chosen, honest. Richard placed his coat on the chair without being asked. He didn't feel like a guest. He felt like someone coming home. Luna appeared around the corner moments later, barefoot, wearing an oversized hoodie and holding 3 mismatched spoons in her hand. When she saw him, she didn't say anything, just ran straight into his arms and hugged him tighter than she ever had. He bent slightly, surprised by the force of her embrace, his arms wrapping around her in return. For a moment, neither of them moved. There was nothing to say. Not right then. She pulled back only to say, "You're late." He raised an eyebrow. "By 7 minutes. That's practically early for me." She grinned, already pulling him toward the table. "Come on, we made dessert." He looked at the table, a humble setup with 3 places, 1 candle, and a small vase with wildflowers. No corporate settings, no silver service, just care, just home. Eleanor passed by, patting his shoulder as she walked. "Sit, before it gets cold." He obeyed, not out of courtesy but out of instinct, like he belonged in that chair, like he'd always been meant to sit there. Dinner was filled with stories, some half-told, others newly invented. Luna spoke about school, her coding mentor, and a project she was building with Janet's help. Eleanor listened, laughing in all the right places, correcting Luna's exaggerations with a wink. Richard contributed where he could, but mostly he listened, not just to their words, but to the rhythm between them, the pulse of a family that had formed around pain and resilience and quiet acts of courage. At one point, Luna asked, "Do you miss your old office?" He paused, then shook his head. "Offices don't miss you back. People do." She seemed satisfied with that answer and offered him more bread. The evening stretched without ceremony, without rush. As the dishes piled up and the candle burned lower, Eleanor leaned back in her chair and said, "We never had a lot, but this feels like everything." Richard nodded, unable to speak, because it did. It absolutely did. And as the night settled, Richard found himself walking toward the door, not with the weight of departure, but with the certainty of return. He looked back once, just before leaving. Luna was clearing the dishes, Eleanor drying her hands. There were no contracts signed that night. No declarations or grand gestures, just a meal, just voices, just the quiet understanding that something irreversible had happened, not in the offices of Iron Trust, not in courtrooms or auditoriums, but right here, around this table, in this house, and that was enough. Richard stepped outside into the cool night, a faint smile on his lips. Behind him, the door closed softly. In front of him, the road home didn't lead back to the tower, but forward, to where he had finally, after everything, arrived. Share your thoughts in the comments. How did this story touch you? We'd love to hear from you. If this video moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every story we create takes days of care, research, and heart to bring to life. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep sharing these special moments. Thank you for being here with us, and we hope to see you in the next one.